So I hope everyone had a restful break. Let's go ahead and start things. And you're welcome to stay wherever is comfortable for you. What we're going to do, I'm just going to guide you in a short reflection that comes from the book by Joan Halifax Roshi that I mentioned earlier called Being with Dying. And she wrote a little meditation. It's kind of in the same vein as when we work with the four immeasurables, where we make these various thoughts towards ourselves and other sentient beings. But anyway, we'll just do a few minutes of watching the breath to begin with, just to focus the mind. And then again, I'll lead you in reflecting on each of these phrases. So I'll give you a little more instruction after we do the meditation on the breath. So again, work with the breath whatever way you prefer. And we'll do this in silence for a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in this reflection. And now we're going to do this brief reflection as a means to help cultivate our own tender heart around this topic of grief, to help us to perhaps be guided through the deep waters of grief, and to come to know our own experience of loss, and somehow also experience some purification through being washed in the waters of grief. So as I recite each of these phrases, I'll pause for a bit and you can simply repeat them to yourself or even find other words that you think encapsulate the meaning of these phrases. And we're just simply again trying to create a tender heart. If you wish, you can even place your hand on your heart as you listen to these words and reflect on them. So I'll begin now. May I be open to the pain of grief. And we simply say this to ourselves in that first person. May I be open to the pain of grief. May I find the inner resources to be present for my sorrow. May I accept my sadness, knowing that I am not my sadness. May I accept my anger, my fear, my anxiety, my sorrow, knowing that I also am none of these. And may I accept my grief, knowing that it does not make me bad or wrong or somehow less for having it. May I be open with myself and others about my experience of suffering and loss. May I find peace and strength that I may use my resources to help others. And may I and all those who grieve be released from their sorrow. And then from that last affirmation, let's generate our motivation again for being here, thinking that we're dedicated to working with our own grief, sorrow, loss as a means to help us to give greatest benefit to ourselves and all beings, so we all can attain a state of peace, happiness that we seek. Again, you can open your eyes when you're ready, and we'll resume. So I did notice there was one kind of question in the comment section, kind of asking, is there something that we would call good grief. We know we have this energy in English, or I mean, sorry, this phrase in English of good grief, that, like what Charlie Brown says. I don't know where the origin of that, maybe why they put grief together with good, because it's usually like a statement of surprise. Um, but again, I think what we're going to be going into this afternoon is really how do we make our grief something that we can label as good. Again, I'm not saying that it's pleasant, that it's that it's without its painful components. Grief definitely is going to have sadness and be accompanied by feelings that are not so much fun to go through. Nonetheless, we can have some goodness to our grief. We can have something that we experience that is useful and be of benefit to ourselves and to others, as we've been talking about. So I, again, think that that's perfectly fine to label our grief good in some way, but again, from a certain perspective. Wouldn't wish it on anybody else, certainly don't wish it on ourselves, but this is the reality of our situation. So the whole point is, how do we then use that? How do we make it grist for the mill? And of course, this is so much of what Buddhism is all about, is that every moment we have an opportunity to move closer towards awakening and being a benefit to others, or move further away. And it's whether we continue to repeat and do the more kind of habitual reactions to things, and that just keeps us in the same groove and moving backwards even, or we move forward with more kind of healthier responses and what have you. So before the break, we were talking about the necessity of grief, and I want to elaborate on that a little bit more in terms of not just why we have to grieve, but what are the benefits of actually going through this process? A bit of what that question is leading to, in a sense. How do we see the goodness in our grief in terms of what is the gift of it? And I'm not saying that this is something I would say to somebody who's newly grieving from a loss. To say, oh, look on the bright side. And that's not what people want to hear when they're grieving. It's not what I want to hear when I'm grieving. Instead, this is something that we can attune ourselves to over time. And we begin to see that we have to take that experience of grieving and integrate it into our lives, integrate it into something that actually helps us to grow and develop and to learn, as we're trying to do with this course today. So one of the things, and that was even mentioned in that little, I hope you liked that meditation from Joan Halifax Roshi, where she said towards the end, one of the affirmations was, may I find peace and strength that I may use my resources to help others. Our grief can actually give us strength. And this is something that we may not acknowledge right at the beginning because we feel so weakened and battered down by grief. But over time, when we work with our grief, you can become stronger through it. You can actually develop a greater courage and conviction. And I found it interesting. I'll share this one little story from when Ed was quite ill. Towards the last few months of his life, he was dealing with AIDS dementia on top of the other illnesses that he had. And he was in bed one time, and I was helping him. And I was kind of lifting him up a bit or something. And he looked up at me and he said, I never knew you were so big and strong. I mean, look at me. I'm not big and strong. I'm not like some muscle man or something, working out at the gym every day. And it took me a bit to process that, but it was kind of like, it was pointing out to me that there are different dimensions to strength, I think. And so we may not be physically strong, but we can become more emotionally strong, more mentally strong. And this is the same thing, what he was pointing out to me in that interchange was, I think, what we can get from grief as well, is that we can come out the other side with greater ability. Having seen our own vulnerability, nonetheless, we can grow from that and develop from that. So I did want to share one little slide that pertains to this whole idea to some degree. This is, I forget who this is from, but this was our little thing we shared before. Somebody named David White. I don't know who this person is other than he's a poet and an author. When I was looking for quotes on grief when I first started teaching this was one that came up. The only choice we have as we mature is how we inhabit our vulnerability, how we become larger and more courageous and more compassionate through our intimacy with disappearance. I like that phrase, intimacy with disappearance. with everything disappearing before our very eyes, day in and day out, all the things that we tend to want to be there appearing, and nonetheless they go. But this is our vulnerability. Grief is definitely pointing to our vulnerability and showing us, again, that we can become more courageous through this. These aren't the initial marching orders when you're dealing with that rawness of that loss, but over time we can begin to see that. I mean, certainly Ed's words to me, as well as what I dealt with after his passing a few months after he said those words to me, really did initially they were very hard to deal with, but they formed the basis upon which I investigated Tibetan Buddhism and eventually became a teacher. I mean, it was all a huge transformation that occurred for me out of that. I've tried in my life to always look at experiences that are negative from a positive point of view, because staying in the negative really doesn't do a whole lot. I mean, we can gain some kind of turning away from things. We're going to talk about that shortly in terms of moving away from the things that are only going to bring more suffering and difficulty, and seeing that we can stop creating the causes for that. But nonetheless, if we're going to experience pain and difficulty in this life, why not make it into something that will enrich in our lives? Something that will actually, again, make us stronger, more courageous. Another aspect of why grief can be very helpful to us in the end is the gratitude that we can have for whatever it is that we're grieving. And if it's a person, we can be very grateful that they were in our lives in the way that they were, that they did what they did for us. And I've been thinking in terms of losing my mother. Every one of us, for our mothers, that's the longest relationship we've had in our life, right? Because it's even longer than our fathers, because we were 9 months in the womb with our mothers. It's pretty heavy in terms of looking at the role they played. But it's true for anyone we lose. They've played some major role in giving us some of our happiness and pleasure, helping us to have something in our lives that was worthwhile. And even jobs or houses, whatever it is that we're grieving, those things were, again, something we can be grateful for. So grief can definitely give rise to gratitude over time. And even I think at the beginning, it can be useful to be grateful for those that we have lost, or for experiences that we are grieving in some way. The other thing, of course, and that we'll talk about more when we get into how to use grief on our path, is the idea of helping us to enlarge our view of love. When every one of us has experienced love from those that we've lost, we can see that as an ability for us to recognize the value of love, the need for there to be more love in our lives. When people disappear from our lives, it doesn't mean that that love is gone. That love kind of carries on and can be extended to others. We can definitely make that loss of someone who we've loved in our lives an opportunity to share love with others. Again, this was what we were talking about earlier today when we see grief as essentially an expression of love. Well, if it's an expression of love, then that love should definitely kind of feed into our ability to continue to have that love for other beings. It also can, of course, help us to connect with others suffering. This is, again, something we'll talk about shortly in more detail. But this is the opportunity that grief often affords us as well, is because we often are blind to the suffering that's going on around us until we have to face that suffering ourselves. It's kind of like when COVID was happening. Unless you got COVID or had an intimate experience with it, it probably still felt like something very distant to you. And then when it became more, much closer, this was true for me, certainly when I was dealing with the AIDS epidemic in San Francisco. It was interesting to see it from a distance when it was just people that you saw in the newspaper or something, and then it was acquaintances, and then it was, people that you worked with and what have you. It became this ever enclosing thing to where you couldn't ignore it, and that it actually helped you to see their suffering when you were actually dealing with it yourself. But the reality is that we often don't have that experience of touching the suffering of others until we've really experienced some measure of pain or sorrow ourselves. So certainly we're in much better position to connect with other sufferings once we have opened up to grief. Here I'm going to share a little story that is from, this also is from Being with Dying by Joan Halifax Roshi, but another story from the life of a Buddha about another woman who came to the Buddha out of her grief of a daughter in this case. And this is about Ubiri, Ubbiri. Ubiri came from a very important family in India. Even when she was a little girl, she was incredibly beautiful. And when she grew up, she married a king. When Ubiri gave birth to a daughter, she joyfully named her child Jiva, which means alive. But not very long after being born, Jiva suddenly died. Ubira was devastated by her grief, torn and wounded. She went every day to the cremation ground to mourn her daughter. One day, when she got there, a great crowd had gathered. The Buddha, who was traveling through the region, had stopped to offer teachings to the local people. Ubira listened to the Buddha for a while, but then left to go to the riverside as usual, where she wept with despair. The Buddha heard her pain-filled keening. He sought her out and asked her why she was weeping. In agony, she cried out that her daughter was dead. He then pointed to first one place and then another where the dead had lain and said to her, "Mother, you cry out, 'O Jiva,' in the woods. Come to yourself, Ubiri. 84,000 daughters, all with the name Jiva, have burned in the funeral fire. For which one do you grieve?" Notice that the Buddha isn't telling Ubiri not to grieve. He's gently tugging open her individual grief into the wider possibility of universal compassion. The Buddha is pointing her toward the place where personal loss is transformed into a piercing tenderness toward everyone who's ever suffered. All of the 84,000 mothers, all of the mothers who ever lived, including herself. And she needs the awareness of a greater community in order to recover and heal fully. So this is this kind of dual effect, like when we are able to open up to the reality that others are suffering in the same way as ourselves, it becomes an extension of our own heart with love and compassion for others. But moreover, it also becomes this huger array of beings that we can include in our field of support. Because we're never alone in our grief, really. We might feel somewhat isolated in those moments where we have that sense of it being our own special season in hell or whatever that Guy Newland was talking about earlier. But nonetheless, when we are able to connect with others through that, then our support becomes immense in terms of we're not alone. We're not some isolated being going through this experience of grief. I mean, I do know from my own experience that I found it really quite liberating in some ways to open my mind to the reality of what's going on in our world. When within a few days after hearing the news of my mother's passing, in my meditation, I was thinking about her, but then I was thinking, think of all those who are motherless, fatherless, childless, sisterless, brotherless in Gaza right now. I mean, my gosh, my own pain seems really insignificant in some ways. I'm not trying to belittle it, and I don't think we have to belittle our own pain. But when we open to that reality that this is not an individual experience we're having, this is a shared experience. Everyone goes through grief. Everyone loses somebody. So in that way, we have these bonds and these connections we can make to others and begin to see them through the lens of love and compassion. To see that when we're grieving for our loved one or whatever situation we have, that there are many others who are sharing in our grief, who are also going through very similar experiences. So we're not alone in any way, and grief can give us that connection with others. Of course, the big thing that we'll be driving towards in the last part of today is that grief really gives us this opportunity to find meaning in life, or deeper meaning in life. Perhaps all of us have some level of meaning, but it can be a way of enriching that, making that even more important and profound in our lives. When I pointed out earlier how my own grief, out of some good fortune, became the window through which I found Tibetan Buddhism, and the way in which I was able to then say, okay, time for me to go do something different with my life. I was working for Levi Strauss in San Francisco as an accountant and finance person. I mean, doing completely opposite stuff to what I'm doing now, right? And it was okay. I wasn't that happy doing it. It was a job. I was getting paid well, what have you. But this was like a real interruption in all of that. and an opportunity for me to look at my life and say, is this really what I want to do for the rest of my life? Is this really how I want to be? Is this what I want to give the world? Is my accounting skills at Levi Strauss? I mean, I'm sure they appreciated it. They certainly paid me for it, but that's not the be all and end all of this existence. And I was really just, so blessed to find Tibetan Buddhist teachings and to be able to kind of move in that direction. So yeah, and I'm not saying we all have to make this profound shift in our life on the basis of whatever experience of grief that we're going through, but recognize that that is sort of that silver lining as well. All of these things are what make this idea of a good grief, what makes it something that we can actually benefit from, is if we go through the experience, as I said earlier, kind of going through it to see the kind of get through the pain by being in the pain, by acknowledging the pain. But then on the other side, to recognize that there's something else that can unfold there that can be quite magical and quite wonderful. So anyway, this is something that I think we'll get into more as we get into the latter part of today. I did want to share one quote from the book that I mentioned. Actually, this is Viktor Frankl. Sorry, I thought I was going to the next slide. I think it's the next slide. Viktor Frankl, many of you know, was in Auschwitz, became a Holocaust survivor and wrote the book called Man's Search for Meaning. He says, without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete. In other words, we do find that there's this paradox again of what we have to go through and all that pain can become an amazing catalyst for something on the other side of it. And it's sort of like the way in which the lotus grows from the mud. This phrase is even going to be coming up in one of the slides to come from David Kessler. We kind of need that muck. We need this suffering, this sorrow to really embrace human life in its totality and to grow and learn from it. So I thought I had another slide in here from David Kessler. I think I must have moved that to later. David Kessler's book is called Finding Meaning, the sixth stage of grief. And his ideas is that is the way in which we eventually move if we are able to get through the full processing of grief. So what I'd like to do, well, let me check in now just to see if there are any questions. I realize I didn't do this at the very beginning when we started now, but now that we've sort of finished off the full topic of the necessity of grief, are there any questions here in the Gompa or on Zoom or comments in terms of anything that's come up for you since we last had a check-in? Yeah, Tony's got his hand up here, so we'll go to him. Yes, Tony.
Thank you. Two things have come to mind over the past minutes. Loss of someone who you love can enables one to understand the depth of their love and the capacity, the huge capacity of their personal love. The other thing is David White and intimacy. Boy, did that hit me between the eyes. The 11 verses that I wrote about my twin dying at birth. The title is Born Alongside Death. The subtitle is And the Intimacy of Sorrow.
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Tony. Any other comments or sharing? Yeah, Phyllis has her hand up here. Thanks, Tony. That was very, very profound. I appreciate that.
So you said what's the, I can't remember how you put it about what, this is Phyllis. What's the advantage of grieving? And one of the most important things for me that I understand and is to avoid depression. If you don't do the grieving, then then you end up in depression. And it's really not worth it. I mean, it's hard to do the grieving. It's painful and there's all this suffering involved with doing the grieving, but it's a lot better than getting stuck in a depression.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for pointing that out. As we'll see when we look at these stages of grieving, depression is one of them, and we might have our moments of it, but to get stuck in it by not grieving can be really, really difficult. Again, I think that could have been also when I was talking about these gentlemen in San Francisco who didn't move on from losing their partners. Part of it was the depression too, not being able to work out of that. And this idea of love having other dimensions when we go through that process. If you don't get to that place, then the love feels stuck with someone who is absent, and it only becomes more depression. Yes, please. Angie.
I had a comment, just reflecting on maybe some positive things that have come from my grieving experience.
Mhm.
And I think that because people in my life know that I have lost someone close to me, if they, like in the past 3 years, if they've lost people, they feel really comfortable and like at ease, like coming to me and like
Mhm.
talking to me about it. And that feels like a gift and like an honor. Um, that and something I've learned that I can be more comfortable with other people's grief and like
Good.
relating to their experience.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing that, Angie. I think that's a really profound thing. Because if we think of everyone in the world, and especially when we talk about this deep grief, where we lose someone very dear to us, there are people who haven't experienced that. They just haven't had that occur in their life yet. And no doubt will at some point if they live long enough for that to occur. But then there's all those people on the other side, of which, many of us are part of, where we are in a different place around that and are a resource for others. And I think that's a wonderful gift to receive as well as to give to others. So I think it's great that you have that experience and, definitely, continue to do that for others because it also enriches ourselves while we are being of benefit to others. So that's great. Hmm. These are great comments. Yeah. Anyone online have anything to share or questions, comments, what have you? Okay. Let's talk about the process of grieving. Again, I'm drawing this from the book on grief and grieving by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Ketzler. Most of you know the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross around death and dying, and these 5 stages were replicated for grieving. But I think in death and dying, I mean, they're not exactly linear there either. When someone is confronted with their own mortality, say they're given a diagnosis of an illness that could very well result in their death in some measure of time, they frequently do go through these stages, and they seem to be a little more delineated there, perhaps. Grief is a different animal. Again, grief has its own way of moving all around through these stages and not seeing them in quite a linear mode at all. So I want to share first a little bit of their comments, which are from the book, that give us a context for understanding the use of these, because I think that they get kind of abused to some degree in terms of the way that they're presented. So they say the stages have evolved since their introduction, and they have been very misunderstood over the past 3 decades. That's when this book was written, or there's a version of it. I don't remember what edition I have. They were never meant to help tuck messy emotions into neat packages. That's the first thing to know, is that these aren't like, oh, okay, that's what you're experiencing, and you can just label it as that and pack it up and know that that's gone or whatever. They continue to, again, evolve and change, even in terms of our own experience. There's nothing that can't resurface over time, especially with grief. They are responses to loss that many people have, but there is not a typical response to loss. This is the other thing to know, is that we all grieve differently. There's no typical loss, so there's therefore no typical response to loss. Our grief is as individual as our lives. Some people might see a preponderance of one of these stages in their grieving process and never experience some of the others. That's perfectly fine. You can't think, oh, I didn't experience depression, therefore I'm not grieving properly or something. It's not meant to be used as a tool in that way. So the 5 stages, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, are a part of the framework that makes up our learning to live. In the book, it said learning to live with the one we lost, and I thought it must be a typo, so I put in the out. It makes more sense to me to say it's our learning to live without the one we lost. I don't know. Anyway, it sounded strange to me to say learn to live with the one we lost. Maybe we're still living with the one we lost and that we're living with a lost one, but that sounds a little strange to me. So these are the 5 that we're going to look at. Again, they are tools to help us frame and identify what we may be feeling, but they are not stops on some linear timeline in grief. Not everyone goes through all of them or goes in a prescribed order. So again, just know that you have permission to just acknowledge this as a framework for looking at what you're experiencing. And that's it. It's not meant to say, oh, I'm this far now. I'm up to stage 4. Now I've only got 1 more to go and I'm out of my grief. Our hope is that with these stages comes the knowledge of grief's terrain, making us better equipped to cope with life and loss. Okay. Let me go ahead and read this one too. People often think of the stages as lasting weeks or months. They forget that the stages are responses to feelings that can last for minutes or hours, or I'd even put or days, as we flip in and out of one and then another. So again, there's no set timeline for these. We do not enter and leave each individual stage in a linear fashion. We may feel one, then another, and back again to the first one. Okay, I'm going to stop there because that gets into, whoops, I didn't mean to go that far and I meant to hit the stop share. Okay, let's talk about each of these because I think in grief we need to understand the dimension of them. And when they were presented as the 5 stages of confronting death, denial, the first one, is a real denial of that this is happening to me. Right? People who might get a diagnosis of a high stage level cancer and know that that might be very well heading to their death at some time in the future, want to deny that and even almost have a need to deny that. I think with grieving, it's very hard to deny the reality of someone no longer being there. That is happening. That has happened. That's a finality. Losing Ed, this was, of course, the first major grief experience, as I explained earlier, in my life. It was profound, the absence of him in my life. I mean, it was just like, he's not there. It's, again, that kind of furniture thing that I was talking about in the grieving brain. There is this really profound sense of that being a reality. So it cannot be denied. And they don't mean denial in that sense. In fact, they describe it as being more symbolic than literal. It's a sense of like, I can't believe it happened. It's like a dream or not real in that way. It's not an utter denial that it happened at all. It's just it seems to be a little bit more removed from our mind. We can't quite get it into the space of acknowledging that that actually is something we have to live with now. So it's a little bit different. Denial takes on that flavor of being more of a way of protecting ourselves from that by thinking it's unreal. And from my experience now with my mother passing, I can say I've already had those kinds of moments where I've kind of like wake up, after sleeping and go, that really happened? I can't believe that really happened. And it's not that I'm utterly denying that it happened. It's just I'm using that as a means of not quite being fully accepting of it yet. And that's, again, totally fine. It's a process involved in the stage of opening up to the reality of that person or that experience no longer being there. Anger has many different dimensions. And of course, when one's confronting it in the stages of death, and obviously it can take on various dimensions there. Sometimes when we've lost someone or something has happened in our lives that we really regret and that we would prefer, of course, that it never had happened, we might be angry at the causes of why that happened, or the injustice, the unfairness, looking at it and going, oh, this never should have happened to me, what have you. Those are ways that we might have some anger manifesting, or the inability to have stopped it from happening. With my mother passed away in her home while my sister was there. We've been keeping one of us 3 kids there in her house pretty much around the clock, over this past couple of years, really. I mean, she hasn't needed that level of care, but we just wanted to make sure she wasn't alone while my sister was asleep. And she got up in the morning and went into the bathroom, or into my mom's room. And my mom wasn't in her bed, so she went into the bathroom, and my mom was on the floor of the bathroom. And she didn't know really what happened. We don't know what happened. She could have passed out and just, hit the floor and died that way. She could have had a heart attack and died. We don't know. So we're just kind of letting that go. But my point is that my sister think was really feeling a lot of anger at like not being there for her at that moment. And I'm like, Judy, you did what you needed to do. Could have happened to any of us. We don't have any control over that. But sometimes we get angry thinking, "Oh, but I should have done this. If only it had gone this way." And we get kind of upset at the way things didn't go. Things go, again, as they're meant to. We just have to sort of let go of that reality. We also might have some anger towards people who are not in grief. This does happen sometimes too, where we're in this very painful, raw place, and everyone around us is maybe, enjoying life and doing things, and there's a disconnect. And we might even get upset and angry that other people are not acknowledging or cognizant of our grief. So beware that that can creep into it. And then, of course, the anger at ourselves. This is a bit of what my sister was having too. The guilt that we might feel it. Oh, if only I had an opportunity to have said this to my mother or do whatever. All these things can come up for us. We start beating ourselves up because we think somehow it should have been differently. It was what it was. We had the opportunities we had. We need to let go of that and not feel any guilt. So guilt has many dimensions. As I said, it can manifest in a variety of ways. And as I said, these things float in and out. There might be times when we might get very upset and angry and think we've dealt with anger, but then something else comes up and we realize that there are other things that we might still have some anger towards. Any comments on those two, denial or anger? Those are kind of the pushing away or making negative thoughts about what happened. Anyone want to share anything from your own experiences with grief that was in that vein that you're comfortable sharing? Or if you're not, again, we can pause the recording too. Anyone? Yes. Oh, is there one on? Oh, Phyllis is going to share. Okay. Oh, Melanie, she was pointing out that you wanted to share. Please.
Okay. Okay. Oh, I found anger to be really surprising to me. And I was not a person with a lot of anger before my husband died. And part of it I know is, he didn't want to die. He didn't, it wasn't anything that he wanted to have happen, but the loss of the attachment, that was my response. Angry that he was gone. And then just a small one that kind of goes along with something that you said about seeing other people. I found myself, and this is something I hear from other people who've lost their partner. I found myself angry in restaurants when I would see a couple sitting there on their phones or reading a paper or, and not communicating with each other. And it's like, you don't have any idea how precious this time is that you have. That's one of the things that I learned,
That's an interesting manifestation of anger in that way, kind of being angry that people aren't really relishing that time that they have with their loved ones. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Thanks for sharing that, Melanie. Anyone else? Anything that you experienced around those two in your grieving or ways you've dealt with loss? Yeah, please, Phyllis.
Hi, this is Phyllis. I mentioned earlier that when my mother died, I was so angry. I was there for weeks before she left, and she was in the hospital, and she wasn't recovering from a surgery. And so once the doctor said, we're going to give up, which took a while, a couple of weeks, then she just let go. All her vitals went. But anyways, I was with her, and there was a nurse with me when she passed, and I just suddenly had so much anger that she left. It was like, you're gone. And I hadn't been angry. I had been sitting and sitting and sitting with her. So it was very interesting. The other thing that I find towards myself, having been through, probably my husband's was the worst, I just saw all the mistakes I made in the process of him beginning to die and then going into hospice, and this is over months. and all the things I did that I wish I could have done differently. And I was there when he passed, and uh, but still, there were so many things that got missed. And like you say, like we're talking about in the grief, when we think about it over and over again, we begin to see more clearly all the maybe mistakes that we made or things that we didn't do right. And that's a hard one. It still is. I still realize how many, I'm probably not as hard on myself about it now, but I'm still, oh, if only I had, yeah, and everything was on my shoulders. And but still, it was like some splitting off of the process in order to get everything done.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now that if only thing comes in to play a lot. If only I had done this, if only I had done that. And it's easy, what they say, hindsight is 20/20. We can see back on all the things that we might have done better, that we should have done while we had the time, all these sorts of things. And that can lead to a lot of guilt, which is really anger, again, generated towards oneself. But doesn't it doesn't help in the end, but it's a process we have to go through. Nonetheless, we still might have to do that self-flagellation in order to kind of get to the other side of that too. And to just kind of be accepting of all of it. It's hard. I mean, myself, when I dealt with Ed's loss, I had a lot of anger at what was going on around HIV in this country and the lack of response, and like, because he died in 92. Again, most of these drugs that many of the people with HIV are working with now came out in like the few years after that. There are people who had AIDS around 1992 who are still alive, and so there's kind of that, yeah, if only, but if only what? I mean, there was no possibility. Those things weren't there. So I just have to, get to some place again of acceptance eventually, but there can be a lot of anger, definitely. Things that we would have liked to have done or had happened before. Anything else on these before we move on to the next one? Next one's the heavy one, the depression. And we talked about that, kind of getting stuck in depression and how it's not such a good place to be. This is where you can also, that what if or if only thinking can feed into that. It can make us feel really sad because we're dealing with the reality of what actually did occur. We may not, kind of believe in some of that type of thinking, but those sorts of thoughts sometimes do provide some measure of relief. Um, you know, um, I'm sorry, the next one is bargaining. What am I talking about? I went on to depression. I was anxious to get to depression. I don't know why. The bargaining is that kind of like thinking, well, if only I had done this, then maybe this other would have happened. Maybe, again, what my sister, I think, was going through to some degree. If only I had gotten up earlier, maybe I would have been there when my mother first fell and I would have been able to call, emergency suitor and everything would have happened in a very different way. And I guess, again, that bargaining does lead us down that pathway of thinking that there's something that we could positively do, something that could have changed it in a positive way. But again, it's a dead end. We're never going to get to a place where you can actually change it. We don't have time machines. We can't go back and do all these things over again. They talk in the book, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler, about how this level of bargaining adds some order to the chaos that we're experiencing. It allows us to look at it in a way that is very analytical and not just be in the space of that chaotic, loss-filled mind. So there's some value to each of these stages of grief, but they lose their value if they continue over time in an unhealthy way. And of course, the bargaining doesn't go anywhere. Like I said, it's a dead-end street. And with bargaining with people who are dying, I think it becomes more of a matter of like, people often think, well, if I change my life, then maybe this illness will go away and somehow I'll, be able to escape death in this way. And they were bargaining with God if you have a belief in God. These sorts of things, again, are a way of putting a structure around how to react to what's going on in one's life. And to think, okay, I'm just going to keep putting the energy there and maybe something will move or shift. I haven't really seen myself doing too much of the bargaining thing. Of course, with my mother, she lived a nice, 94 years of her life, and everyone says it's of some comfort that she had that long. But you always hope for more, right? But nonetheless, I don't really feel like um, that's one that I'm seeing that much. Let me go on to depression. So we had denial, anger, bargaining, depression. This is, of course, getting into the territory of it is completely natural for us to have sadness and some level of depression on the basis of losing people in our lives or losing a job or, again, all the things that were discussed when we went through our introductions, the ways in which people are experiencing loss. It's perfectly fine to have those. It's once more, again, not something that should be continued or furthered simply because it ceases once more to become productive. Being in that sadness is part of the buffalo going straight through the storm, right? It's what we have to do. We have to get into that place. It's the sitting Shiva that I was talking about, where you have 7 days of experiencing that grief. It's whatever you need to do to process your grief. One of the things that I did a few months after Ed died was I decided to treat myself to a week. It wasn't quite a week. I think it was 5 days down at Esalen. Many of you have heard of Esalen Institute in Big Sur. Wonderful place. And I didn't want to go to like a workshop thing where you're doing all kinds of mental stuff. Ed and I used to like to go out backpacking and stuff. And so I decided I would go there for a little nature trip. It was like exploring the nature of Big Sur while being stationed at Esalen, but done with a bit of a spiritual angle. The guy who led it was very much of that mindset. But that was what I needed for my own healing, and to be in a place where I could be with nature and to allow whatever feelings I was having to come up. But what was interesting is I got to the last day that I was there. I was sitting beside a little stream that was coming down from somewhere up in Big Sur. I don't know. It was really beautiful. And this was October. So there were some fall leaves that were in it and everything. And I was just watching it and being with the flow of the river and got to that place of just recognizing that this is what life is. It's just a flowing river. And we just need to kind of be able to let go of any moment and hold on to it, because it's not something you can hold on to. The whole thing's just going to keep flowing. So I got to a place through that sort of processing of being with my grief and my sadness in an isolated environment where, even though there were other people on this week-long thing, I wasn't interacting with them that much. And they all knew that I was there in a more active grieving process. But I think this is an important part of it. And I want to kind of emphasize that each of these stages, once more, can be seen as, through some lens of respecting the value of them. Depression or sadness is an important part of the grieving process. And if you have people who are not feeling that, I'm not putting any judgment on it, but there's probably something that isn't happening that needs to happen. They're not getting in touch deeply enough with the reality of that loss. And we'll all react differently. I'm not saying we all have to do the same thing. We all have to get depressed or have some sadness. I think that that's part of what we really mean by grief. And I think that we would be denying ourselves and denying the process if we didn't experience some of that. Let me share one little quote in regard to this idea of sadness. This is from, no, this is the meaning thing. Where am I at? Okay. I thought that it was on sadness. Oh, well, I thought I had a quote in here on that, but nonetheless, let me leave this for a bit. Sorry, I realize that in preparing this week, my mind wasn't completely focused a lot of the time. So I hope you're patient with me today. So usually I'm a little more organized, as many of you know. But for some reason, I'd like getting the slides and my own kind of talking about it synced up was a little more difficult. Nonetheless, any questions or comments on depression and bargaining? These two, your comment. Yeah, please, Phyllis. Bill? Oh, you can get the microphone to Phyllis. That's okay. Thank you.
So depression and sadness are very different. Depression is impacted feelings, not feeling them, not walking into the storm. Do you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so, one way we talk about, sometimes there's a depressed place that you go to,
Sure.
but depression is a long-term situation where you're not feeling
Mhm.
and you haven't had the opportunity or courage to go to Esalen and sit by the river or by the stream and just be with with the grief.
Sure.
And so it's very different, but sadness is
Yeah.
great. Sadness is feeling and it's crying and keening and, wailing or whatever you can do. There's different kinds of grieving that we can all do.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think in terms of what we might call clinical depression, then we're definitely talking about a different animal. But I think a lot of sadness can feel like depression and can be in that mode. But again, not something that we get stuck in necessarily.
Exactly.
And that's the differentiation, is when it becomes something that carries on and becomes a, I don't know, more a
Not
pathology.
feeling, you're not feeling feelings. You're
Right.
just
Yeah.
in this deep, dark place of shadow and not
Yeah.
able to transcend it into anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to share, I think it's the quotes, I didn't put them in as slides. This is the way that they talk about it in terms of depression a little bit. It says the stages of loss, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance have been widely used and misused. Our society almost seems to be involved in a stamp out depression campaign. Sometimes intervention is vital, but most of the time we do not allow the normal depression that comes with grief to have its place. So again, they use the term in that context as being sadness, maybe that's a bit more heightened sadness to where someone perhaps again is not finding the joy in eating food or listening to music or things that they might normally do and living in a space of that would be probably hard to distinguish between more clinical depression. But it is a part of the process and not seen as, again, a pathology per se. But it says clinical depression is a group of illnesses that may be characterized by a long-term or excessively depressed state. But our society often considers an appropriate sadness to be depression requiring fixing. Normal depression is the sadness we feel at certain times in our lives, the common cold of mental illnesses. We even have television advertisements offering help with it, selling pills, promising to get rid of it. When a normal depression becomes a clinical depression requiring professional help, antidepressants may be helpful for a time. When depression follows loss, though, there are specific sorrows that can be identified. In more serious and long-lasting depressions, it is difficult to receive support. In this case, and it goes on talking about it, but this is the kind of differentiation that they're making. Whether it's technically correct or not, I don't know. I'll leave that to other people. But I think that we will feel some level of depression or sadness. I certainly did at Ed's passing. I don't know that I have it as much with my mother. There's a sadness there. I don't know that I'd call it a depression yet. I mean, don't think so, but yeah, I don't know if maybe Melanie wants to share anything from her experience in working with people around grief to clarify this. Yeah,
I will. I'll just say
please.
this is actually from Wolfelt. He talks about the difference between depression and sadness and grief as the focus of your attention. For depressed folks, the attention is usually on themselves. I'm a bad person. I'm no good. I'm unworthy. For folks who are grieving, the focus is on the person who's died. I miss this person. I miss being with them. They're yearning for the person. So it's focused sort of toward the person who's died as opposed to negative aspects about themselves. So that's just another way of maybe thinking about it too. And
Right.
again,
No,
that's
thank you for sharing that, Melanie. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that perspective of it either. But it kind of makes sense. And when we were talking in Buddhist terms, the same sort of thing, whether it's love or attachment that we're experiencing the pain of love, and love no longer having that being there to love is sadness and can be managed in that context. Whereas the pain of not having what we're attached to and our own self being the main driver of that, we're not getting what we want, what we need. And then it becomes inflicting upon oneself. That's kind of interesting. Yeah, I think it's a similar idea. Let's go on to talk about the final of these. I mean, it's called acceptance. And in the case of grief, it doesn't mean that you're all right with what happened. I mean, as I said, you're always going to feel the pain of that person or that thing having happened in your life that you're grieving. That's something that lives with you, that kind of carries on with you. think what we mean by acceptance here is kind of learning to accept and live with the reality of loss. That's a different form of acceptance. It's kind of moving into that place of, this is a part of me now. The wound has kind of been incorporated into me in a sense, so that we then live from that place of being our wounded selves with that, and again, growing and learning from that. So this kind of is a nice lead in then to what we're going to talk about with the remainder of our time, is kind of what are the tools that Buddhism gives that helps us to certainly, kind of move in that direction of making meaning out of all of this. In terms of acceptance, let me read just a little passage. There was one I'd marked here and on grief and grieving around that too. It says, as we heal, I think this is the right page, page 25. Yeah. As we heal, we learn who we are and who our loved one was in life. In a strange way, as we move through grief, healing brings us closer to the person we loved. A new relationship begins. We learn to live with the loved one we lost. We start the process of reintegration, trying to put back the pieces that have been ripped away. I like this idea of that there's something on the other side that almost is a closer relationship to the person by virtue of our having gotten to that place of acceptance. I don't know if anyone has an experience of that they'd like to share in terms of their own life, but I think acceptance can have a lot of gifts to it as well. Getting to that place where we acknowledge that this loss is now a part of us. Anyone? Yeah, Phyllis, please. I'm glad that you're sharing and have things to share. They're all worthwhile. So thank you for doing that. Okay. Thanks, Bill.
I had an idea to say, and at the moment, then I went blank.
That's okay.
It's 13 years since my husband passed, and yeah, it's a very different relationship with him. I mean, because I really remember him and have lots of memories, really positive, mostly,
Right.
of our relationship and what that was like. And I've learned, this is why I've learned so much about myself that I didn't know, because I was so connected to him and so focused on him.
Right.
And that's the important part for me. It was like, I didn't know who I was. And actually I said that after he passed or before he passed, because he asked me if I would go with him when he left.
Wow.
And I thought about it for 6 months. I didn't just say, no, I'm not going to. I said, let me think about it, because often parent partners do pass pretty quickly after.
Right. Right.
And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I really hadn't done my own work.
Right.
Being so focused on him and our life together that I hadn't stopped and looked at myself. So, yeah, I've learned so much since, in this time period, and still am. It's not stopping now.
Right.
Yeah, very, very amazing, surprising. I didn't know what I was saying when I said I didn't know who I was. Didn't know how difficult that might be, actually.
Right.
But also wonderful, because, I work with people. So what I see is more and more people who choose to work with me, and I choose to work with them. The more inspired I am, and trust that inspired voice to be there, and that inspired presence, and that whatever I do has a big influence on how they are.
Wonderful.
It doesn't, I don't have to say it, but I just have to be honestly taking care of many, many aspects of myself so that they can profit from that, and they can grow and transform. So that's probably, I don't think I've ever said that in public before, but I have
That's
privately said it to a few people. So that's probably the most important part. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. What a gift then to learn this about yourself and to be able to use it with others. That's great. So let's take a short little break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about this sixth stage that David Kessler talks about, just because it's a good segue into the remainder of it. This idea of finding meaning as being the sixth stage of dealing with grief. So let's go ahead and do about 5 minutes. So I think it's right around 2:25 here, or 2:35, sorry. We'll be about 2:40. So just try to take 5 minutes and we'll come back so we can use the rest of the time to talk more about the last subject here. So great, thank you. Okay, so before I go to the slides with a couple of things from David Kessler, I might just share with him something that is, because we've been talking about these stages or this process of grieving. And I think we all know this, but know that even if you feel like you've sort of settled all these five, you've kind of gone through them or whatever, it doesn't mean that grief is going to be completely absent from your life in terms of that particular situation or person. David Kessler calls these grief bursts. bursts, bursts. It's kind of a weird word to say. He says, I often talk about grief bursts. Even though someone may think they put the worst of their grief behind them, they have moments when, seemingly out of the blue, they burst into tears, overwhelmed with feelings of loss. These moments are all the more painful because they are so unexpected, and people are often caught off balance by them. But there are comparable experiences that I call love bursts, those moments when suddenly, for no reason at all, we feel a surge of emotion for someone and tell them how much we love them. Contrary to what you might expect, those moments don't end with death. There will be times when you will suddenly well up with love for the person you lost. You may feel that that love has nowhere to go because you can't hold your loved one, but the love continues. If you allow yourself to feel it, you will find great meaning. So it's kind of nice. He talks about these grief bursts, but then also love bursts and ways that we might, see things that will seem distant from the actual experience of having lost that person, but nonetheless are part of the process. We will definitely carry all of this with us. As I said, it's sort of a wound we carry with us, but it's also the love that we carry with us, particularly of those that we have had very, close in our lives, people that we've experienced a good part of our life with. So let's talk about this sixth stage very briefly. As I said, it's meant to be more of a segue into what I'm going to talk about for the remainder of our time, which is finding meaning. David Kessler said in his work with people who are grieving that he found that this was often a sixth stage that was a outcome of having really confronted and worked with one's grief. And as I said, for me, it was definitely a piece of the picture when I processed through to some degree Ed's passing, and then found Tibetan Buddhism, and then found like a new career in my life in a sense of becoming a Buddhist teacher. It was definitely in the vein of finding some meaning in my life that I didn't have before. So this is what David Kessler says on this. He says, the grieving mind finds no hope after loss, but when you're ready to hope again, you will be able to find it. Bad days don't have to be your eternal destiny. That doesn't mean your grief will get smaller over time. It means that you must get bigger. So this phrase of like grief not becoming smaller, but you becoming bigger, I think is in the vein of this idea of finding meaning, of kind of ourselves growing to inhabit the space of grief in a way to where the grief doesn't seem quite as big because we've gotten bigger, we've grown, we've developed, we've learned. So he says, as the saying goes, as I mentioned earlier, no mud, no lotus. As most of you know, the lotus flowers grow in like the muddiest, uckiest part of the pond, but that's what they need in order to grow. And they kind of rise up above the mud and flower unsullied by the mud. The most beautiful flower grows out of the mud. Our worst moments can be the seeds of our best moments. They have an amazing power to transform us. So we're moving into that vein of this idea of like some of our painful, difficult experiences actually being the wellspring of growth for us. But as I will say one more time, this is not the advice you give to somebody immediately upon experiencing loss, because that's not what they need to hear is, hey, you should feel really lucky because this is what you're going through. It's going to be an amazing opportunity for you. That's not what it feels like at that point. It feels very raw. So let's talk a little bit about using grief on the path. Pema Chodron even speaks to this in the way she talks about it in the book called When Things Fall Apart, which I actually revisited when the pandemic started. I thought, okay, that sounds like a good book to revisit and reread. Our whole world falls apart, and we've been given this great opportunity. Once more, I would not say that to anybody who's in a very fresh experience of grief, but this is ideally how we want to look at things in Buddhism. Our experiences of the past, or I'm sorry, experiences of the present are created by our actions of the past, by what has happened that has shaped that. As we talked about earlier, that fifth remembrance, we are the continuity of our actions. So what we are experiencing in the moment, be it loss, be it, having wonderful things, everything is a product of our past actions. And the way Pema Chodron talks about it is not to look at it in this kind of reward punishment kind of idea. Oh, I did bad things, therefore that's why I have these negative things in my life. Or, oh, I did good things, that's why I have all these delicious, delightful things. But rather to look at everything we're experiencing as the opportunity for us to learn. Essentially, she says, karma is life giving you the lessons you need to learn. So if we have certain things happening in our life, the Buddhist perspective, ideally, though it may not be in the moment, is to say, what can I learn from this? What can I learn about how to live my own life, how to change my mind, whatever it is I need to do to make that into a very rich experience? This is in the vein of what we use in Tibetan Buddhism. We use the term lojong. Lojong means mind training, mind transformation. The idea is that many of the thoughts that we bring up when we're experiencing loss or difficulty or suffering are not the most helpful ones. Certainly, even though we can condone anger and the list of things that we have to go through, anger is not a positive state of mind in the long term in Buddhism, because it doesn't lead to anything but further suffering. It only creates more suffering for ourselves and suffering for others. So when we encounter something that is unfavorable in our lives, the purpose, the kind of, if we want to see a purpose to that, if we want to try to view it through that lens, it's to help to point out to us how the habitual ways that we've reacted to it have only got us in that situation. Whereas if we change our responses and actually transform our thoughts, we can have very different experiences. That's the whole gist of Buddhist practice. Essentially, it's all mind transformation, thought transformation, trying to change how we see, perceive, think about things in our world and experiences that we are having. That will change our future experiences. And that's the gift that we're given in the present moment of being able to deal with whatever it is that's on our plate. Yeah. So this is the idea behind it. I just am kind of explaining that in brief before we get into the kind of more detailed teachings that we're going to take a look at. What I've done is I've structured the main teachings, or the way we're going to work with this, through the lens of they're called the three principal path. Oops, going out. Three principal aspects of the path. But that's going to kind of get us into, again, that dimension of Buddhist teachings. So that's coming up, I think, on the next slide. This is, or next set of slides, this is a kind of, again, what His Holiness was saying. I started reading this earlier, and this is actually the quote from the Book of Joy, where His Holiness was talking about teacher. He says, the way through, I don't know if this is going out again or what. No, are there other batteries available? Maybe, I don't know, because it has been quite a few hours now. Let's change the batteries, and then I can read this, and if you can fill in the blanks when I'm reading it. Through the way through the sadness and grief that comes from great loss is to use it as motivation and to generate a deeper sense of purpose. When my teacher passed away, I used to think that now I have even more responsibility to fulfill his wishes, so my sadness translated into more enthusiasm, more determination. So what this is saying, I think, is pretty evident, but nonetheless, when we experience sadness, it can actually be channeled into having more enthusiasm and more determination to practice whatever it is we feel is our purpose, our meaning in life. And of course, in Buddhism, it's to gain realizations of what the Buddha taught and to eventually try to help other sentient beings. So he says here, I have told, this is His Holiness again talking, I have told those who had lost their dear friend or family member, it is very sad, but this sadness should translate into more determination to fulfill their wishes, or to fulfill the wishes of all beings, as we do in this tradition. If the one you have lost could see you, and you are determined and full of hope, they would actually be happy. With the great sadness of the loss, one can live an even more meaningful life. So again, this is kind of the setup for how we're going to take a look at some teachings of the Buddha. The three principal aspects of the path: renunciation, bodhicitta, and the correct view of emptiness. Most of you are familiar with these, but I'll give a little context for each of them. We can say that if we take the path to Buddhahood and we cull it down to like three main ideas, these are the three ideas. These are kind of what we're really guided to kind of have a good understanding of and to really integrate into our minds. The first level of these teachings is to look at starting with yourself. Lama Yeshe used to call renunciation, this first set of teachings on the path, self-compassion. And when we begin to see what we experience in terms of loss and grief and the varieties of sufferings that are in existence, again, what we call dukkha, this unsatisfactory state that we've been experiencing since beginningless time, and we will continue to experience as long as the causes and conditions are there for that. The first step is to have compassion for ourselves, to look at our own situation and to say, okay, how long am I going to continue to deal with all of this? How long am I going to be in a situation where everything is constantly unsatisfactory, or I have to deal with the unsatisfactory nature of not being able to find true peace and happiness, not being able to avoid the pain of aging, illness, death, and so on. Again, it doesn't mean that those things completely go away. It just means that we are able to transform our minds completely to where we no longer have the pain of those experiences. In His Holiness the Dalai Lama, many people hold him to be a Buddha. There's still going to be a death there. That being is going to go through the process of death, just as he's gone through the process of aging and illness and what have you in his life. But there's no pain happening for that being. There's no suffering really happening for that being. You know, things of life, they become suffering by virtue of how our minds are conditioned. And so we are conditioned to have a suffering experience, what we call samsara. The very first step of the teachings of the Buddha is to turn away from that, to say, okay, that's unsatisfactory. There's no need for me to continue to be in that state of suffering. We have to want that for ourselves before we want that for others. That's why the teachings initially on the stages of the path that we study in this tradition are all about our own situation. First, looking at the reality of our karma and how that is dictating our experiences, and we have to take charge of that. Stop creating the causes for our own suffering. So when we see the suffering happening in our lives, we go, wow, okay, I need to stop creating that. What I was talking about earlier, I mean, essentially looking at things as something we need to learn from. Karma is life giving us the lessons we need to learn. So when I have any of these things manifesting, I go, okay, I'm creating that. That is my stuff. This is my grief, my suffering, my sorrow, my loss. How did I create that? Well, in general, we're creating everything by being in this conditioned existence. Therefore, I have to be more concerned about what I am doing. That self-concern isn't meant to be selfish per se. It's meant to be a necessary step for us to even begin to identify with the suffering of others. You know, some people may treat it as a more selfish regard and only want to achieve their own freedom. But nonetheless, most of us are here with this mindset of really wanting to be a benefit to others. Well, we have to know what we need ourselves before we can be a benefit to others. Master Shantideva says in one of his verses, how can someone who's never had that thought for themselves alone possibly want it for others? If we don't want liberation for ourselves, freedom for ourselves from the round of existence, from samsara, how can we possibly want that for someone else? So the idea here is that anything that we experience, and here we're focusing on grief or loss, we look at it and we see this is evidence of the unsatisfactory nature of samsara. This is evidence of how painful our existences can be, that we have to go through these types of experiences. We have to experience loss. Yeah, the inevitability of it. When the Buddha was saying, you know, it's inevitable. Aging is unavoidable. Illness is unavoidable. Death is unavoidable. Being separated from those we love is unavoidable. Well, he wasn't meaning utterly forever, and there's never ever going to be some freedom from that. He said, yes, this is the way our existence is now. And we have to learn that that is a part of it. And moreover, first, see it as unsatisfactory for ourselves. See it as, I don't want to experience this pain, this difficulty. I don't want to continue to go from life to life, being separated from those I love, having to face things that are unsatisfactory. And that's what the whole first set of the Buddhist teachings are. Let me put on the screen one little slide that speaks to this. This is from Guy Newland's book. He says, to love others, we first must love ourselves, wish well for ourselves, and then gradually learn to see others as similar cases of beings who, just like ourselves, want happiness and don't want suffering. But the first step, loving ourselves, can be notoriously hard. So this is the idea that we have to sort of get familiar with, is that we need to turn the lens of compassion on ourselves initially. I know that in our culture, this is really hard. I don't know that they have as difficult a time working with this in the Asian cultures. Maybe they grow up in a very different culture where that's embraced. We have this tendency to think that somehow I'm being selfish if I look at my own situation. It's not selfishness, it's genuine self-concern. It's being aware of, okay, why am I in this predicament? Why am I having to experience grief, lamentation, sorrow, all the sufferings the Buddha spelled out in the teachings on the Four Noble Truths, all these things that we see as unsatisfactory. We have to really get that we are the creators of this. And we can stop creating it by practicing what the Buddha taught. The Four Noble Truths are essentially the first one saying, guess what, folks? You are in the situation of dukkha. It's unsatisfactory, and you need to see it for that. What the Buddha said, you need to know the truth of suffering, the truth of dukkha. Secondly, you need to kind of abandon the causes of that, because we're creating the causes of that through our own deluded minds, our own crazy minds, and of course the actions we engage in. The third noble truth is that we can create an end to all of that. There can be a cessation of that experience. Dukkha can be over once and for all. And the fourth noble truth, there's a path that leads to that. So we have to actualize that sensation through cultivating the path. All of that takes renunciation. In order for us to actually engage in the Buddha's teachings at that level, we have to see the faults of samsara. We have to see that this is one of the biggest faults that we have to experience, is being separated from those that we love. Not having being continually confronted and bombarded with loss and suffering of a variety of forms. This is what we have to, unfortunately, see for what it is. But once we see it for what it is, it shouldn't make us depressed. Shouldn't make us like, oh God, I'm hopeless. Because the Buddha did say in the third and fourth truths that there's a way to accomplish that end, and we can do it. The Buddha did it, and we can do it. Because the Buddha was just like us. The Buddha isn't some other figure from another world or something that was always in this perfected state. Buddha was a being just like us who simply practiced these teachings to a greater degree than we have. So this is the very first level, and it sounds kind of strange. And as I said, this is not the first advice I would give to somebody who's newly grieving is, oh, well, you should see the suffering of all this for what it is and then turn away from it and develop renunciation. And as a Buddhist practitioner who's been around the Dharma for a while, I'm trying to assimilate those teachings right now in my grief, but that's because I've had some time around the teachings. But most people are not ready for that right off the bat. They need to once more go through the sadness, but realize that from that sadness, that's like the mud from which the lotus will grow. We can find that deeper connection to the Buddha's teachings and what the Buddha is really promising to us, which is complete freedom from all of this nonsense. Never having to experience really the pain, the difficulty of these situations again. Yes, things will happen because we'll still be involved in the world. And as I said, I think a Buddha deeply grieves for the suffering of the world, but doesn't experience the kind of painful aspects of that. Is totally capable of being with others in their pain and their difficulty and helping them. And this is ideally where we want to go. But with the first step is to have compassion for ourselves. To really get that we have to see our own situation clearly. Does this make some sense? Any questions or comments on that? Because I'm going to talk about the two other principal aspects. They might take a little more time, but anything? No? Well, so this self-compassion is a means, as was said in that quote. Let me put it back on the screen from Guy Newland, as a means to awaken to loving others. To love others, we must first love ourselves. Wish well for ourselves. We can say love and compassion are companions in this. So to have compassion for others, we must have compassion for ourselves. Love and compassion are the root of the second principal aspect. I call this including others. So we start with yourself, then we include others, and this becomes compassion. We could include in there love, compassion, and love for other beings, which ripens into this mind that we call bodhicitta. So I think most of you are familiar with this mind, but let me just give it in a nutshell, an explanation of it. Bodhicitta, the word literally means awakening mind, mind of awakening. Bodhi is the same root as Buddha. It means to awaken, and citta is the mind that aspires to awaken, that wants to awaken, but not awaken just for ourselves, awaken for the benefit of all beings. So this idea of first we have to see the suffering of ourselves before we can see the suffering and the situation of others clearly. So when we are grieving, I've already pointed this out, earlier today, our grieving can become a very important opening to the suffering of others. Right? Not once more that's what you would initially say to somebody. Oh, well, what are you grieving for? Think about all the other people grieving in the world. I mean, that's not the way you would say it anyway. But the point is that your grieving is a very important touchstone to being able to see the suffering of others. Just like anything that you say, even being cognizant or more conscious of your own aging, of illness, of any of these other ways that we suffer. They can all be a doorway through which you can open up to universal concern. So bodhicitta is driven by these two minds, the mind of loving kindness that wishes for all beings to be happy and to have the causes of that, and the mind of compassion that wishes for all beings to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And moreover, bodhicitta, we advance those to the level of becoming what we call great love and great compassion, where we want to be the agent of causing that for others, where we say, I will place all beings in happiness and the causes of happiness. I will free them from suffering and the causes of suffering. It's an extremely heroic mind. Earlier, I talked about this afternoon when we started again after lunch, I talked about how working with your own grief can help strengthen you and make you more courageous. See these different layers of strength that can be there when you've actually confronted your own pain and your own difficulty, your own vulnerability. Well, that's the sort of courage that we need to keep channeling into bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is a tall order, right? Seems a bit messianic or something like we're going to save all the world through our own being or something. It has that flavor to it, but obviously it takes a lot of courage to want to do that. To want to be the agent of helping all beings to be free from suffering and to achieve their greatest level of happiness. That's, again, a really tall order. Something we have to cultivate again and again and again and again. Can't think about bodhicitta once and then have it stick completely. It requires a continual feeding everything into that. Some of the main ways that we work with Lojong are to channel all of our experiences of suffering into compassion for other beings. So one of the techniques that they often use is this idea of, it's kind of within the context of Tonglen. Most of you have heard of Tonglen, Tibetan words that mean taking and giving. They actually are opposite, giving and taking in that order of Tong and Len. But Tonglen is a practice of taking away the suffering of others and giving them your happiness. Now, when you're in a raw place, this isn't the advice most people want to hear, right? I'm supposed to take on more suffering when I already have my plate overflowing. But the idea is over time, we might have an ability to do that. But Lama Zopa, he would often encourage us even to look at, okay, look at what's on your plate right now. If your plate is overflowing, if you have like grief up to here and you can't take any more grief or suffering on, well, then at least hold the thought that through your having to go through that grief, through your having to deal with this suffering, that others will not have to do so. That's a pretty powerful thought, right? I mean, imagine like if you said, okay, I've got a headache and I'm going to think that through my having to deal with my headache, others will never have a headache again. That's already pretty amazing, right? It starts with these kinds of thoughts where we think, okay, I'm dealing with grief. I'm dealing with this loss. May others never have to experience this again. No, it doesn't mean that that's actually going to happen because others will still have to go through their loss. We're talking about strengthening our hearts, making us more courageous, making us to think that I'm going to endure this pain, this suffering, this loss, this grief, so that others don't have to do that. This is a very profound practice. Of course, in Tonglen, as I said, you can get into that place eventually, perhaps, where you can think about all those who are grieving in the world. Think about all those who are grieving in Gaza right now, having lost their homes, having lost their welfare, don't have food, having lost relatives, children, parents, whatever it is. And try to breathe that in, take that into yourself, wishing for them not to experience even one more moment of that grief and loss. And then to give them everything that brings them happiness, giving away all of your merit, all of your positive qualities, all of the resources you have, mentally giving it to them so they can have happiness. That's a really profound practice. I don't expect most people, again, when they're actively grieving in a raw state of mind, to be able to practice that way. But it's something to aspire to. And at least, as I said, to have the thought, if I'm going to have to go through this storm, like the buffaloes just charging through it and get through that pain, well, at least may it be the cause for others to not have to have that pain in their lives. That's how we begin to generate this courageous mind of bodhicitta, the mind that feeds into our desire to help all sentient beings to that degree, to become a Buddha for their sake. So there's a lot to work with here in terms of this second principle aspect of the path, because it's feeding in our love, compassion, this whole idea that we are not going to make our suffering in vain, in a sense. Our grief and our loss is not something that we just all about me and all about my situation. We actually think that this is a tool by which we can benefit others. We can strengthen our own hearts so we can eventually be of greatest benefit to other beings. So doing Tonglen with our grief is very useful. As I said, it's not necessarily something that we're all going to sign up for right from the get-go, but to realize that that is a practice that helps us to overcome that habitual tendency to be somewhat isolated in our own pain. In fact, Guy Newland, back at the beginning of this, when he talked about what he wrote this book for, he said, this book is about that isolating sense of specialness. It is about awakening from the delusion that our pain is a private prison. We're all in that prison. All of us will be in different, kind of states within that prison, but our private pain, or our pain is not a private prison. This sort of specialness we might feel at us having to endure the particular loss that we have, yes, it is unique. And as I was listening to everybody tell their stories this morning, how they introduced themselves, I can see the uniqueness in that each one has a particular thing that brought them here, right? Each of you have something that happened with your experience that has brought you to a place of some grief. Nonetheless, that sense of specialness isn't indicative of you having your, private prison of pain. You are in a prison that we are all in. And to kind of see it in that lens, to kind of extend beyond this view of our own situation being that special and unique. One of the things I might point out too that Guy Newland talked about in here, which I really thought was useful, is he says, seeing others, this is where he's talking about his wife, her name was Valerie, and she was a psychotherapist, I believe, as well. And she had a lot of clients that she was treating even during her illness. He says, seeing others' pain and feeling that we just might be able to ease it in some way, often this is the best therapy for our wounds. Some of Valerie's last visitors came without even realizing it to get off the books therapy from the dying woman, and she helped them. And this actually helped her. And then Guy Newland is talking himself. He's a university professor in Michigan teaching Buddhism. He says, I did feel put upon when, within a month after Valerie's death, People pressed me to give talks, to help with scholarly problems, and to assume leadership roles. But those who imposed upon me in this way, forbearing my negative mindset, gave me the chance to become helpful and were therefore great helpers. So this is another dimension of it, is that Guy Newland was actually seeing in his own grief that when people asked him to be of assistance and help, that it actually was of some help to himself. The whole gist of these teachings that I'm talking about around developing bodhicitta and love and compassion revolve around this idea of what His Holiness frequently says. He says, if you're going to be selfish, at least be wisely selfish. The idea is that we actually get our deepest measure of happiness and well-being from thinking of others, from being of benefit to others. I know once more, when someone's in that raw place of immediate grief, that's not what they want to. They don't want to be told, oh, well, then, you need to think about going down to the homeless shelter and helping to feed people there and taking care. That may not be the immediate feeling, but we can find, even within a short amount of time after an initial experience that causes us some grief, that we gain a lot by being in a place of helping others, by getting out of ourselves and putting that to the side so we can then genuinely be with others. I know, Tony, you had a phrase that was along these lines, but I remember the one that I also heard from, I think it was Jack Kornfield in one of his taped teachings, where he said, I think it was a quote from, can't remember his name now. Anyway, he said, the less of me there is, the happier I am. Like the less that we kind of have it all be about ourselves, the happier we actually get. What was the phrase you had, Tony? Yes. So the less of me that exists, the better off I and everyone else is. Yeah, that gets into the emptiness teachings maybe to some degree too, but which we'll get into in a moment. But there is this sense of kind of liberation that happens when we're able to kind of get ourselves out of the picture, when it's about others. Yeah. And it made me think of Amata and all of her work with the animals at the sheep sanctuary, where, her whole focus is on caring for those beings. When we are in that mode of genuine care and concern for others, it's fulfilling in a whole different way. And I know from knowing Amata that it is fulfilling for her, as difficult as it can be too. It's physically challenging sometimes and what have you, even emotionally challenging. It's the only way to be in the world. This is what the Bodhisattva path is, essentially, is a path of helping, a path of being a benefit. And we have to kind of keep working in that direction. But to recognize that that's the true source of happiness. Master Shantideva says, all the suffering there is in the world comes about from wanting happiness for myself alone. All the happiness there is in the world comes about from wanting happiness for others. This is really the secret behind all of it, and behind creating good karma, behind doing good deeds, behind achieving the path to enlightenment. If we are fully dedicated and put our kind of confidence in this rule of just taking care of others, continually being attentive to them, doesn't mean that we totally burn ourselves out. We have to do some self-care because we're not enlightened yet. But we do even self-care with the motivation that we'll be able to get back up and do the work for others. This is what bodhicitta is all about. And I do think that there's an avenue in our processing of grief where bodhicitta can develop, rooted in love and compassion for beings, by seeing our own situation clearly and then being able to use that as a lens through which we see the situation of others. So let me see, I think I may have had another slide to share on that. I think I do. This is again from the Book of Joy with His Holiness and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. While depression certainly collapses our circle of concern inward, the periodic feeling of sadness might actually widen it. Researcher Joseph Forgas concluded that sadness may have some benefit in our lives, which may be why people are drawn to music, art, and literature that makes them feel sad. So this idea that sadness can actually be an avenue through which we can have concern for a circle of ever-widening beings. It's interesting, a teacher friend of mine, Tenzin Choki, she told me about a book. I actually read it last year, I think I read it, called Bittersweet by Susan Cain. She had written a book called Quiet, which was about introverts and that kind of dimension of our world. But this book, Bittersweet, was all about sadness and why are people drawn towards sad movies, sad songs, sad experiences, what have you. It's because that taps into this sort of empathy that we then can have with others. And grief is once more no different than that. If anything, it's one of the most palpable and rich experiences that we have in our lives because of the many dimensions of it that will allow us to connect with the suffering of others. This is, what you were saying earlier, Angie, in terms of you become of benefit to others by virtue of having had your grief and then being able to be of comfort to others who are in the midst of theirs. What a wonderful gift. And that can blossom into all kinds of ways that we can be a benefit to others from the place of acknowledging their suffering and being aware of it, and being genuinely, compassionately concerned about it. So that's the second of the three principal aspects. The last one, of course, is the trickiest one to talk about, and perhaps the one, at least Guy Newland certainly found, wasn't as useful as the other two, perhaps. This is the third principal aspect. We were, again, to call down the Buddhist teachings in terms of the path to Buddhahood, to enlightenment, seeing things as they really are, or what we call wisdom, the wisdom teachings, which in this context is a correct view of what we know as emptiness. Emptiness is this idea that we and others and everything that exists isn't self-established. It isn't kind of creating, it doesn't create itself in terms of even what it is. It is a product of a variety of things, but nonetheless doesn't have any of that kind of inherent identity. I'll explain it a little bit with regard to how Guy Newland sets it out, who, by the way, has written some very good books on emptiness and the two truths, ultimate truth and conventional truth. He says here, in the Buddhist tradition, we say that in the flow of change, there is never any fixed thing we can point out that corresponds to the things named by our language. So we name, for example, this wonderful flower that's here. What is this, a chrysanthemum? I don't know the names of flowers. Is that what that is? Is that a chrysanthemum? We'll call it a chrysanthemum. So we have this flower that we're going to call a chrysanthemum. What Guy Newland is saying is that we never find anything that is the real chrysanthemum. Chrysanthemum. I should just call it a flower. We'll call it flower now. Okay, so there's no real flower here, meaning like if we look at, we're simply labeling this collection of stuff as flower. It's got all the petals and the little bits in the middle, the pistil and stamen and all this other stuff going on in the stem and what have you. We have all of this that we are labeling as flower. And if you go investigating and do that analysis, you don't find any real flower here. Where's the real flower? Is it in this petal, that petal, the other petal? You say, well, it's all of it together. Well, all of it together is a collection of a lot of stuff. And do you have like a zillion flowers here, or do you only have one flower here? It gets to be kind of elusive. We don't really find this unitary phenomenon that we call a chrysanthemum or a flower or what have you. We are unable to locate that. This is speaking to the fact that everything that exists arises in dependence upon other factors, but doesn't have any independent established existence. It doesn't exist as that flower from its own side, in other words. But this is true especially for people, for beings like ourselves. There's no real you or I in this context of having some ability to set ourselves up. Instead, there's just this simple label of course, I think of this as I. You think of it as Don. Those are two different labels, but nonetheless, we're talking about the same basis, which is this collection of mind and body that is simply being designated as that. There's no real Don here. There's no real I here. And of course, the teachings on emptiness encourage us to actually do that investigation. We'll go looking for that real I. Where is the real I? Yet our whole lives are driven by this strong sense of an I. This fiction, in terms of the way we think of I, doesn't exist at all. The I still exists, but it's very, very subtle. Again, just as an idea, a thought. I think of this as I, therefore there's an I. Nothing more than that. Merely imputed, merely designated. So what Guy Newland is introducing us to here is this idea in Buddhism, there is nothing that is that fixed thing that corresponds to what we're naming something, calling this eye, calling that a flower, what have you. So he goes on to say, it's useful to think of things and people as though they had fixed identities, but they actually don't. They are like fast rushing streams. This kind of ties into impermanence, but they're not the same thing in terms of absolute, if you realize impermanence, then you realize emptiness. Emptiness is certainly informed by impermanence, because if things are impermanent, they can't have any fixed identity. They're constantly changing. Everything and person is what it is only in relation to a perspective, a point of view. Nothing exists as this or that from its own side. So everyone and everything is empty of existing in the way we usually see them. For these reasons, Buddhists say that in an ultimate sense, there is no dying and no one dies. This takes a pretty kind of focused and intent mind to get to that conclusion. I'm not saying emptiness is probably the most difficult teaching to really get our heads around, because it is a bit of an elusive concept. But even having done the analysis, to get to the point of recognizing there really is no dying and no one who dies, I think that's pretty profound. Once more, I wouldn't say that to somebody who's freshly grieving, say, well, what are you grieving for? Your mother didn't actually die, and there's, there never was a mother that could have died anyway. Well, how does that help? And that's exactly what Guy Newland says. I'll share on the screen here. So it is that when someone asked me in the early months whether my familiarity with teachings on emptiness had consoled me in my grief, my reflexive answer was just no. All I could think was that Valerie, empty or not, was definitely around here, here before, and now she is definitely not. And that hurts. So I think once more we have to be careful in terms of, this idea of what was being taught here in emptiness. Emptiness is not saying that there is no person at all, but it is getting at this very, very subtle way that things actually exist. That for our minds that are so inclined towards this incorrect view, it seems like people don't exist at all. It seems like this reality that we have been buying into has no reality. That there's nothing there. That's one of the dangers, they say, is you can fall into this nihilistic bent where you think, oh, well, then if things are empty of this way of existing, then they don't exist at all. There's no real I, there's no real you, there's no real death, there's no real anything. Well, there is still these things. These things still do exist, but they exist in a very, very subtle way. You have to get pretty far in your analysis to get there. So we have these two extremes that we're trying to find this middle way between. Not utterly denying any existence, but also not holding the things existing in this concrete way that we've been mistakenly thinking that they existed. So anyway, Guy Newland goes on to say, of course, that we need to find that middle way and really understand what is the implication of it. To deny this is to miss the middle way. Those who think emptiness cancels out this fact that there's a being who was lost, who it hurts to experience and whatever, cannot have understood. They cannot really be understanding the middle way if they think that somehow emptiness means that we shouldn't be grieving at all. That's why, again, I'm so intent upon wanting to teach about grief in a Buddhist context, because it doesn't in any way deny the sadness that we feel, the hurt that we feel. That hurt is still there, but we and that hurt are not concrete in the way we think they are. So then he concludes, he says, Valerie was here, now she is not. This is true and it hurts. It must not be denied. And to deny it would be to miss the middle way, to really miss how things actually exist. So I'm throwing it out there simply as to give you this whole context of these three principal aspects. This is a very important topic in Buddhism, the correct view of emptiness. But don't think once more that your experience of grief is going to necessarily lend itself to a perfect understanding of that, but it can over time, once more, because it's still pointing at that ignorance is operating underneath our grief to some degree. It is holding on to things being kind of in a more fixed nature. I know why it's so hard sometimes when we come to Buddhism I think Melanie was pointing out in her introductory comments when she introduced herself about how comforting it can be for Christians when they think about, oh, I'm going to meet my loved ones in the afterlife. My mother thinking, oh, I'll be back with dad again when, this all is over. Well, that fixed identity in Buddhist terms, there is no fixed identity. There's no fixed person. There's a continuity of consciousness that happened to be labeled my mom and labeled as my dad and labeled as each one of us. But that person, when that life ceases, that person is over. That experience is gone. The continuity of consciousness goes on, informed by karma, to create another existence. There's no fixed, real, pointable identity that carries on from life to life. Instead, there's just this iteration that is constantly changing. We have to eventually undermine that if we're ever to achieve our own liberation, much less Buddhahood. So take it for what you will. I'm not, again, making this to be the ultimate panacea for our grief and sorrow that we're experiencing. And Guy Newland even said, no, it wasn't really of much comfort to him at the time. But it is something we have to eventually realize. And I think that to hold on to that idea of a fixed identity, that somehow we're going to meet again in some future life, we won't. That is not a reality. We might interact with that consciousness again, but we'll be a different being and they'll be a different being, and who knows what that'll look like, that little dance that is going to go on in that iteration. But this is maybe, again, something that might produce some pain in our lives, but the goal of it is actually to do the opposite, to make us realize that when we are grasping so tightly to those fixed identities, this is a trap. It's not actually going to get us anywhere, and it's only going to create more suffering for ourselves and for others. That's the gist of it. I hope I've conveyed it clearly enough to be able to take it away from, what I said with that kind of meaning. That's a bit, again, more about how to actually relieve our suffering as opposed to causing more of it. But the teachings on emptiness are very dangerous for us in that regard. We have to be sure that we're well trained in them and that we are meditating on them correctly. That's why this is pointed out as the correct view of emptiness. It can have a lot of distortions to it. So let me share some concluding thoughts and then we'll see if we have any questions to conclude. I'm going to go maybe a minute or two over. One of Guy Newland's quotes that I actually liked, which goes back to our conventional reality of what this existence is all about. To be human is to set sail for the next shipwreck. This is, what we are essentially doing every day. We have no idea when the next shipwreck is going to happen, but we're constantly setting sail for it day after day. Who knows when the next, thing will happen? But not to make that into something depressing again, but to recognize that this is a part of the nature of existence, and we have to see it for that, and moreover, see that it can be different if we can practice the path. I'm going to end with Mary Frances O'Connor, though, because even though I started with her about learning, and I hope I've kind of done that for you in giving you some ideas about how we can use grief as a learning experience. She says in her book, this is towards the end of it, she says, we cannot change mortality. That's, again, the next shipwreck, I guess, that we're sailing for. We cannot change the suffering that accompanies loss. We cannot change intrusive thoughts and waves of grief. But if we have the courage, we may be able to learn to respond to these indisputable circumstances with greater skill and deeper understanding. The challenge is, of course, the wisdom to know the difference, learning when to pause and reflect and when to push on. The mysterious and overwhelming feelings of grief require wisdom, but wisdom is gained through experience. So again, it becomes a bit of a circle. Through our grief, we acquire more wisdom, but we need that experience of grief, to continually feed into it. It's, again, part of the process of learning. We turn to our loved ones for what wisdom they can give us. We may turn to our spiritual or moral values to guide us. Finally, we wait for our own brain to develop the wisdom to discern the best course of action that comes with learning from each new day's experiences. Okay. Questions or comments? Tony, please. No.
Thank you, Don. I think this kind of forum is really excellent. This is just my second or third time in this kind of forum, and it's been of great benefit to me. And it'd be great if TNL can incorporate more of this kind of forum into the teachings. I'm just speaking personally. But definitely not at the cost of the regular teachings. But there is a link up between what the Buddha says and what you say and what people say in this room. The Death Cafe that I attended when I came out about my twin dying at death, that was an extraordinary thing for me in a lot of ways. One of the most extraordinary things was I did write short verse about it. And I finished the verse on April 2nd. Because, and Janice and Anil recommended a book titled Drama in the Womb. And it's about twins dying. Janice had a twin who died early on in the birth process.
Wow.
And I wrote these 11 verses. They told me about the book. I got the book on August 6th, 4 days after I wrote those 11 verses. The way the book described my particular, my twin dying at birth, totally validated and verified the 11 verses that I had written 4 days prior. So that's the kind of, I don't know, buoyancy, support that
I
I
understand.
think we can get out of this kind of thing. It's
Good.
That's the human part.
Thank you. And I appreciate that DNL has embraced this idea of doing these things occasionally. This is, I don't know, the fourth or fifth one that I've done as like an all-day Saturday thing. I've got some more coming up later this year. We haven't even talked about what I'm doing. So we'll see what those are. But nonetheless, I will pass that along to Venerable Dundrup and Nina so that they know that this is something the community finds valuable and useful. Yeah, good. Thank you. No, but I think I can speak to what other people have said after some of the previous ones too, where they were like, oh, this is good that we have an opportunity to come together and talk about forgiveness or talk about other things that we don't necessarily get into in the everyday teachings here. So, yeah. Any other comments from today or? So again, I realize again, this is a tough topic to approach, and I've given few things, ideas to work with, some of which come from, again, a more conventional context in terms of these other researchers and people who've worked around grief, but also trying to apply the understanding of Buddhism to it. So I do hope that you're able to adapt some of your own experiences within the context of these teachings and find some use. But please let me know if you need any further guidance individually, because especially if you're dealing with some difficulty in your life, it is helpful to talk through with a teacher or what have you. And it's always a rich experience for me too when I talk to other people about what's going on for them. So I'm always appreciative of that and more than happy to offer that. So let's have some closing thoughts then to make sure that all of what we've done today brings forth the best possible result. Oh, I'm sorry, we have another hand raised. Sorry. Yes, Marianne.
I
Sorry.
just wanted to know if you're doing a handout.
Oh, I didn't really have a hand today. What I'll do is the slides that I prepared, I will get them to, and he'll probably get them on the website, but you might have to go back to this teaching to the page and there might be a materials link there then. I'll get it to him later today and hopefully within the next few days, he'll have that on the materials link. So I'm sorry, thank you for bringing that up. Because I did want people to have a copy of those slides if there was something in there that you didn't get a chance to write down or that you'd want to go back and look at. Might need to touch them up a little bit here and there, but anyway. Okay, so let's do our dedication, thinking that what we have done here today, may this produce the greatest possible benefit to help ourselves be free from our own suffering, our own pain and difficulty, but moreover to help all sentient beings to achieve complete freedom from all pain and to actualize their deepest potential. Let's dedicate also for the good health and long lives of our teachers, especially His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and also dedicate for the very swift return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who left us in that form a little over a year ago, making strong prayers for his reincarnation to return to guide us and all beings on the path to enlightenment. And lastly, let's dedicate for others that we're holding in our hearts. I mean, whether it be places in the world where there's great pain and grief and suffering, or whether it be others that are more directly in our lives that are experiencing problems. Kind of share this positive energy with them. Send it out to them so they become free from their suffering immediately and have all the causes that will lead them to true peace and happiness. And may all beings have true peace and happiness through what we've done here today together. And thank you all so much. I don't know why this thing keeps going. Maybe it's just me. Because we can't have gone through like 3 sets of batteries. It's okay, but we'll deal with it. But thank you all so much for coming today. And again, I hope this is of some benefit, and I'll see you all again soon, hopefully. Okay. I think the next time I'm coming back here
Thank
for a
you
Saturday is
very
in
much.
August 24th, I think, something like that. But keep your eyes open. I haven't, again, we don't know the topic of that one yet. So, okay. Be well, everyone. Thank you.